Outside of the devastation in Iran and Lebanon caused by the illegal US-Israeli war on Iran, the biggest story so far has been the petrochemical crisis caused by Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. This has pushed the price of a barrel of oil over $100, and this will obviously have a knock-on inflationary effect throughout the entire economy as energy prices underpin almost all of production. At the IMF Spring Summit, it was predicted that further rises in oil prices could lead to global recession, something that's happened only 3 times in the last 40 years, save for the coronavirus pandemic. Although at the very least, central banks are learning from their lessons from the last oil crisis that we had. In the wake of higher than expected growth figures across services, industries, and construction, Governor of the Bank of England Andrew Bailey seemed pretty dovish over potential interest rate rises in response to the crisis. This is at least some good news for the Labour government. God knows they need it. They were already unpopular due to unforced errors and facing another wave of the cost of living crisis just coming around the corner. They could at least be spared the hawkish approach to rates that ultimately led to the demise of the Conservative Party in 2024. But the coming double-dip cost of living crisis won't just be confined to the increased cost of petrochemicals. The government has recently held secret meetings for what's known as Exercise Turnstone, an emergency contingency plan in case British industry is impacted by carbon dioxide shortages due to the closure of the Strait, a critical commodity for the food industry. The meetings wargamed potential worst-case scenarios, such as the Strait being blocked until the summer, a situation that could potentially, if situations arise, lead to an 82% point drop in CO2 supply at most. CO2 is used in both the slaughter and packaging of certain meats and to carbonate drinks, meaning that whilst shortages would not necessarily lead to critical food shortages, they could lead to a lack of variety in shops and certain businesses being unable to operate, such as farming and hospitality. Now, Business Secretary Peter Kyle was asked about these plans by Sky News' Sophie Ridge this morning.
On carbon dioxide specifically, because we talked about farming, we talked breweries as well, I'm right in saying, I think as well, because they kind of add the fizz to drinks, beer, maybe for the World Cup, perhaps a concern for people. How long kind of stockpiles do we have of this stuff?
At this moment, this is not a concern for our economy.
Okay.
I can reassure people of that.
You'll be able to get a beer for the World Cup.
If that changes, we will be. I will speak about it and I will make an announcement about it. But for this moment in time, there is not the concern because I have taken the action.
Okay, thank you. And look, it is, like you say, you never want to be alarmist with the stuff, but it's also important to kind of get the information out to people
If any of these things change, I will be upfront with the public about it in advance so that we can prepare. But right now, people should go on as they are, enjoying beer, enjoying their meats, enjoying all the salads. But also, there are critical uses for CO2. MRI scanning, for example, water purification. It's involved in our nuclear industry, our civil nuclear power industry. So some defensive uses for it as well. There's lots of needs for CO2. So these are the reasons why I took it so seriously way back just 6 months ago, not just in the last few weeks.
Now, it is quite a breath of fresh air because God knows I have plenty of bad words to say about Peter Kyle, and I have said many of them. But when you compare that kind of reaction in terms of a basic laying out of the facts from a government minister, and the fact that there has been preparation months and weeks in advance to ensure that we have all of the situations that could possibly happen already done, compared to Boris Johnson skipping all of the Cobra meetings. Was it 5 that he'd skipped during all of what happened during the pandemic? It really is night and day compared to the absolute shambles of what the Conservative Party are like, wasn't it? Now, any visible shortages of certain products could nevertheless lead to public discontent, which the plans say could compromise government messaging around the security broadly of food supply, although world fertilizer shortages could also hit food inflation due to the Hormuz blockade. Another shortage that would be very publicly visible is jet fuel. The International Energy Authority has warned of flight cancellations around the corner due to jet fuel shortages and due to Europe's lack of stockpiles. Deliveries that set off pre-blockade, they're still arriving, but this is due to dry up very soon, meaning cancellations could be coming as early as 6 weeks, just as families prepare to go away on holiday during the summer. Families in the UK have already borne the brunt of pressures on luxuries as costs rise. Having their summer holidays impacted by flight cancellations could spell doom for the government, although at the very least there shouldn't be any cancellations before the May elections as far as Starmer is concerned. Now, Dahlia, this is obviously showing just the amount of power that disruptions to global trade has to influence broader economic problems, not just in terms of very specific commodities that have knock-on effects to the energy sector, but anything that underpins other industries globally could also have knock-on effects affecting access to food, access to certain businesses that could lead to further problems, and as was mentioned by the IMF, potential global recessions, right? So what does this tell us about the future state of globalization and of free trade?
I mean, I think it's really, the last 5 years has been a real wake-up call for a lot of people living in Europe and in North America, that you can't wreak havoc, or at least you can no longer wreak havoc throughout the world and be completely insulated from the effects of that. I think there is something quite distasteful about, in that Sky clip, of, people in Lebanon right now are burying their relatives in temporary graves, and Sky News is like, will we still be able to get a beer in the World Cup? And I'm just like, how? Anyway, these people live in a different world to me, perhaps. But look, when it comes to sort of the future of globalization, I think it's going to be interesting to see how different governments, particularly in the West, sort of respond to the fact that it is becoming very clear that there are weaknesses and vulnerabilities in these global supply chains that mean that we are feeling the impacts of disruption throughout the world in a way that perhaps we didn't beforehand. And of course, this is also all happening in a context of climate breakdown, which is its own kind of shock and is going to cause its own kinds of disruptions to the supply chain of various essential resources, from food to energy to fertilizer to everything else. And if we look specifically at the way that Starmer is responding, I think there's been some interesting developments. But, throughout sort of this idea that we sort of had, let me start actually with Starmer's response. So Starmer wrote an article, quite an interesting editorial actually, and the man rarely does anything interesting, so it really did catch my eye. He wrote an interesting editorial in The Guardian last week, I believe, where he basically talked about the idea that we are no longer living in a world of relative stability, that the world is now entering an era of repeated, substantial crises and shocks, and Britain needs to be prepared for that kind of world. Now, he's sort of hinting to what Adam Tooze calls a polycrisis. And I think it's important that he recognizes that. I think he was very much elected on this myth of this return to normal, or this kind of return to, bureaucratic kind of tinkering around the edges.
Stability was the change. Stability was the line that they went with in the election.
Stability was the change, and now it's clear that actually change is the stability. Change is the sort of the defining feature of this era. That's really important. And he says, we need to develop like an industrial strategy and an energy strategy that prepares Britain for this new era that we're entering in. And sure, we need to decarbonize our energy system. We need to localize our food system. We need to think about the ways in which we can exist in a world where shocks and crises are the norm. When you look at the past sort of 5 years, I would say that this era kind of started from 2008, but even if you just look at the past 5 years, you have the pandemic, you have Gaza, you have Ukraine, you have the cost of living crisis, you have various climate crises throughout the world, and now you have Iran. Maybe we could have dealt with one of those things quite effectively, but that number of deep crises happening in such a short space of time is something that we are not able to deal with. But the problem remains with Starmer is that he cannot help but be Starmer, which is first of all, what's missing there is a lack of understanding of the responsibility that Britain holds and has historically held in creating the unstable world that we live in. And so part of that is, for example, no longer bankrolling and legitimizing and offering resources and support to one of the key agents of chaos in the region, that in the Middle East, that is causing a lot of these shocks, which is Israel. Until you address, it's not like you can just retreat into Britain's borders and create this self-contained Britain that can be resilient to external shocks. You also have to address the role that Britain is playing in generating those shocks. And second of all, there is no acknowledgement yet from Starmer that in order to actually protect people in this country from these shocks, you are going to have to enter into a new social contract. Gone are the neoliberal days of we just let corporations get bigger and bigger and get fat off different crises and fat off shock therapy and disaster capitalism. Gone are the days where energy companies can profiteer off energy crises. We have got to enter into an era where the state is willing to intervene on behalf of its citizens, to distribute wealth fairly, to stop profiteering from crises, whether it's windfall taxes on oil companies or stopping supermarkets from exploiting the cost of living crisis to raise their prices. And so we're going to have to radically rethink what the role of the state is going forward. And we are not seeing any evidence that the Starmer government is willing to do that. We saw recently the IMF basically issuing a diktat to Rachel Reeves saying, don't you dare think about offering blanket support to households and small businesses to protect them from the energy crisis that is emerging from the war on Iran. And she basically said, yes, sure, no, we're not going to offer wholesale blanket support for households to protect them against rising energy prices, because she fundamentally does not think that it is the role of the state to do that. So even though we're seeing kind of rhetorically an acknowledgement of Starmer that his stability is, that change is stability or stability is change or whatever, is no longer viable in the world that we live in, we still are not seeing the political will to actually, in light of that changing global context, rewrite the social and economic contract and political contract that this country has been running on for the past 30 years that cannot protect people effectively from the kind of world that we're entering.
I remember you saying in your contribution there, the people's obviously to blame, obviously, were creating this crisis in Israel. There's been no kind of acknowledgement of that given what's happened. And there's obviously protests happening in Ireland at the moment around fuel. I think they're happening in Norway as well about the price of diesel. And they're both protesting the government. And there is farmers in the UK threatening to protest the government as well over the price of fuel here. And I'm like, should we be protesting at the Israeli embassy by any chance? Given this, these are the people who caused this massive wars, right? Just saying.